basically the palette is very simple. In terms of the reds, I'm using alizarin crimson, not cadmium red, because again it's a transparent colour, more transparent than cadmium. So lemon yellow, raw sienna, ultramarine blue, and some cyan blue, and that's going to produce these really zingy colours. So I'm going to be painting from this photo, which is one of the ones I sent through, with a lovely sweet chestnut tree in the foreground, nice and twisty, lots of sort of big branches coming out of it, lots of shapes. But what I'm going to do is just start with the distance, and because this was taken looking at the tree, the sky looks white. Well, I don't want a white sky. I've soaked my paper by haking it over with water. So what I'm going to do is start by, let's bring this water closer to. I'm going to start by putting a raw sienna wash across the middle of the paper, like so. A bit more water if it goes on. So I just want a hint of colour, and I put that on first because if I put it on second, I'd corrupt it with the same brush. So now with my sky, I took this photograph, there was colour in the sky, the camera hasn't caught it because of the exposure. So I'm putting on an ultramarine and, again I need to re-wet it, an ultramarine and slight amount of phthalo or cyan blue to produce a subtle sky colour. There we go, just graduating it in. And just bringing it down, not actually overpainting the yellow, I'm just bringing it down to the yellow. And you may find if you're doing this, you want to flatten your easel over so that you don't get gravity getting to connect too much. So I might just tip it a bit to start with. I'll bring it back into view in a moment. If it starts to puddle, you can rinse out your brush. You can grab some more tissues. Here we go. And just take a damp brush through that bottom strip. I've tissued the brush to stop it putting too much water there. So I'm just producing a very delicate graduated wash. Now I'm not going to see much of this, there's not much sky, but you put it everywhere to get continuity. Okay, so I'm just going to take out the excess water with my tissue. So not much. Now the trick of this is to get everything looking like clouds. So instead of producing grey clouds, I'm just going to use green clouds. So let's go for some lemony yellow. And again, I'm watering it right down. And we can just start placing it. Because I've got a bit of blue in there, I haven't even put any blue into the lemon yellow. It's neat lemon yellow, but I'm painting it over a blue sky whilst it's still damp. And I'm just doing it in patchy strokes, which hopefully will just soften as they dry. So lemony yellow for the green, especially for the brightest greens, which are over in this area. Okay, so it's just like painting clouds, but with a different colour. And then we paint a deeper green, and at this stage now we can introduce the ultramarine. You could use cobalt blue to do this as well, and you could use, actually, before I do that, I'm going to do my cyan blue. Sorry to rethink. So cyan blue will produce a very sharp blue, but particularly there's a holly tree down here, and this is just for the pale colours in the holly tree. It's a very blue-green. So that's with cyan blue. And for distant trees, they are very blue-greens in here. They're not bright greens. So the distant greens, I've used this very, very weak cyan blue mix going through here. Almost minty in some areas, more blue than yellow. And it's an opportunity to get some sparkling colour in, even though it's very delicate. And there's some minty greens up through here as well. I'm probably overdoing that, but I can always come back with more yellow. But there's a trick to this, because I'm painting right across here, and you're thinking, what about the tree and the highlights? I'm sure that's your concern. And it might be wise at some stage quite soon to stop doing what I'm doing, because what I need to do before it dries into the surface is some tissuing back, some lifting. So I put my brush down, get my tissue paper, and I'm just going to go into the highlights on the trunk of the tree and the branches of the tree and lift out where the sun's catching the branches. And you need to do this quite quickly with acrylic, because once it dries into the surface, it cannot be moved. So it's just some little patches, and in fact you can even do this using your credit card and wrapping it round the credit card in this manner. So this is half a credit card, but it enables me to lift out some thinner shapes for some branches. And it's not getting right back to white, so I've probably left it a bit too late. But you can see I'm just softening the colours in a few key areas. If it doesn't quite go back to white, you might get a second chance using a small hog brush. Using a small hog brush. There we go. This brush might just lift a bit more than just the paper on its own. There we are. So I've got to highlight back here. So I'll now tip it back again so you can see it better. So it's a bit, I think I've probably done this a little bit slowly because the edges are a little bit harder than I normally like. If you find out a problem and you think you can't do it any quicker than me, you can always use gum arabic or even your glycerin, paint it into that first wash, and it will preserve, just like with watercolour, it will keep it wet for longer. So let's move on. The paper does cockle a bit because I haven't properly stretched it, but it will go flat as it dries. So we can just put some colours lower down on the same basis. Let's get back to my first brush. And what I'm also going to do is have a second brush in hand, and then a third brush in hand for controlling what I do now. So I've got 2 more Chinese brushes, and now we can paint the lower part, which is crimson and raw sienna, to produce some warmer colours, a bit more raw sienna, get the balance right. And so this is to paint the brackeny areas. And because that's looking very strong, I then chase it immediately with that damp brush I told you about. So just soften it in as you go. I could re-wet things, but it works very well just to literally paint something and immediately soften it. And occasionally you just leave a few of the dry edges because it represents a bit of bracken or a bit of branch or something else. So you just put it on as quickly and as freely as you can. To paint the ground though, I do want to re-wet the paper. So grab my hake and get some more water and re-wet. And even though we've got some very bright sunlit areas, I'm going to paint this in sort of bands of colour like this, but I need a stronger colour. So I then add the ultramarine blue to my raw sienna and crimson mix to get a deeper browny colour. And it's up to you how you interpret it, because in some lights you could see these shadows as purple, in other lights you could see them as brown. That's a bit too purple. So I add more raw sienna, and again I'm keeping it very liquid. And a tiny bit more blue actually, so I get the colour, that's better. So this is the embankment here, which the shadows from the trees are producing these, there's a little bit of variety in the colour here, producing these curving shapes. You want to be leaving this dappled light behind, and if you want any artist to help you with dappled light, you have a very rare opportunity to consult His Lordship Renoir, because Renoir could paint dappled light. He couldn't paint anything else, but he could paint dappled light. His dancers and etc. Dappled light, very clever, but he couldn't paint people very well. They're okay, and he couldn't paint landscapes particularly well. They're okay because he was copying Monet, but they weren't brilliant like Monet. But in terms of dappled light, he's your man. So you're allowed to consult him and see if he comes up with a solution, because he was brilliant at painting this and really getting the effect of light, coming through the trees and producing, patches of sunlight. And whilst it's damp like that, you've still got the chance to get a twist of paper and soften this and produce a bit of texture in it. It's not quite Right, so I am basically painting like a watercolourist at this point. But now I've got colours over most of the paper, I can start to put in some detail. So what I will do with this scene is let that dry, and then I'm going to draw my trees. Before it dries, I might just make the holly a bit darker, and to get the holly darker, I'm making it a strong green again using my cyan blue and lemon yellow. But then I'm going to add the crimson, and then you get a green. The balance right. You don't want much yellow in this green, so a bit more blue into it. And then we're going to aim to get a really nice, there we are, holly green. Okay, so that's with the addition of crimson. And again, I'm just going to paint the holly in lots of splurgy strokes like this, and then I'm going to immediately chase those strokes with my Chinese brush, but I'm also going to try and break them down a tiny bit. So they're painted into a slightly damp surface, but they've gone in, you know, a bit hard. Doesn't matter, because we're just going to put a few more in. And then, in fact, what you can do at this point with your holly is you can, to get off the excess colour, you can do this. You can push it in with a split brush and produce a little bit more at the edges in particular. Break them down with a brush like that. But I've left, you've got these lighter colours in the middle, and I'm going to exploit them in a minute to produce the actual trunks of the trees that are, well, both the holly, and there's some more sweet chestnuts and oaks and all sorts in there. So that gives me a dark to that side, and at the same time I might even put a bit of depth into the greens over here. A bit too dry, just chase that with a bit of water. Just produce a bit more dark over here, because I want the light to be centering in this area.